Since we've had cars, car owners have been trying to make them faster. Most manufacturers have been trying to make them more reliable. Cars come from the factory with a bunch of stuff designed to make it run a certain way. So how do you make it faster? Tuning! Tuning is trying to get the right mix of variables for peak engine performance. Back in the day, it was actually quite similar to tuning a musical instrument. You'd tweak some screws and you'd listen. If it sounded right, you did a good job tuning. And if not, it mostly meant tuning a carburetor. The carburetor's where the air and the fuel mix before they go into the engine. Too much gas and not enough air makes the engine run rich. Too much air and not enough gas makes the engine run lean. So it'll either rev too high or idle, or it'll sputter out if it's not tuned right. Choke? Wait a minute. We'll talk about carburetors in a different episode. We're talking about tuning. The degree to which these flaps can open and let in air is determined by a screw. And the chamber where the gas and air mix is also tweakable on a carb. A tune-up meant that a mechanic would make sure your timing belt was adjusted properly, your ignition is happening at the right time, and that the right mix of air and fuel is getting in the engine. We've looked at torque curves before. An engine performs best right here. We've also talked about cams and lifters and push rods, but back in the day, if you wanted to change this peak, you had to change out some hardware. And essentially, you're moving the peak maybe from here to here. This new configuration meant you had to tune the engine to work optimally at this point, thanks to the new hardware. Same thing with adding a blower. You'd have to tune the engine to get the right air-fuel mix into the engine because you're changing another variable away from how it was set at the factory. But even when you're making your engine perform better, you're tuning it for this optimum spot at one place on the curve. You couldn't really do much about performance in these rev ranges or these. Then, something happened in the late 70s and early 80s.
Say it, hold on to gas!
Manufacturers were tuning down engines to make less horsepower and get better fuel economy. And to stop people from tuning their own cars, they put these little caps on top of the carb adjustment. And to make sure the air-fuel mix was staying efficient, they used ECUs. Early ECUs mostly measured oxygen going into the engine and coming out. They used this signal to control a solenoid that would determine how much the carb would open or close and how much fuel would be getting mixed with the air. They were effectively taking the tuning out of the hands of the owner.
Why?
If you wanted a different air-fuel mix, you had to either trick the computer or reprogram it.
It's hacking time.
This is when tuning, as we now know it, started taking shape. It also opened the door for computer-controlled variable valve timing and computer-controlled ignition timing. What? By the way, an ECU is the same thing as an ECM, or an engine control module. The ECU really only controlled fuel mix in the early days, but it started becoming more important as fuel injection started getting refined. And later on, manufacturers added transmission control modules. Eventually, they started putting them together with the ECU on the same chip, which makes it a powertrain control module. But forget all this alphabet soup. Most people now just refer to the whole thing as the ECU. Now we know that the ECU is a little computer that gathers information from sensors placed all around your car. Data gets sent in from wheel speed sensors, engine sensors, O2 sensors, airflow sensors, temperature. Oh, there's so many sensors. Relax. The ECU takes all of it and does millions of calculations every second to determine how to control everything from the air-fuel mix to transmission shift to the engine's red line. The ECU also identifies problems while it's sorting through all that info. As ECUs became more common and engine and emissions equipment became increasingly electronic and complicated, car manufacturers started to put in diagnostic ports to make it easier to figure out exactly why the engine light was on. But there was no industry standard, so they used whatever kind of port they felt like. To figure out why the light's on, you might have had to connect some pins to the port, or gently caress a tiny screw on the ECU. Then, you'd wait for the warning light to blink out a code, and you'd look up the fault that code corresponded to. Or maybe you could buy an expensive proprietary scan tool and/or computer to make things a little easier on yourself. But every manufacturer had their own idea of what these ports should look like. And eventually, the government mandated that all cars came with a standardized onboard diagnostic system so they could better monitor emissions and keep a car running clean. So from the 1996 model year and newer, every car is equipped with a universal OBD2 port. Why am I talking about OBD? Because an OBD reader can tell you all about the little things going on inside the engine, and that can help you tune your car. We mentioned all the things that go into tuning a car: valve timing, ignition timing, air-fuel ratios, and more. And now, these things are determined by a computer. Tuning programs the computer to optimize engine performance by changing any or all of these variables. Let's look at that torque curve again. With old school tuning, you could change an engine's performance, but you're really only gunning for the best performance right here. Big cams, open valves, lots of air, lots of gas. When you're jetting a carburetor, you're tuning it for this spot. When you tune the distributor, you're tuning it for this spot, and everything else was off. But now, because so many things are controlled electronically and valve timing can be varied, we can change things like ignition and valve timing without changing hardware and make it better at different RPMs. So we can't do too much to this part of the curve because that's where the engine performs best. What we can do is fudge some valve timing, intake, fuel injection, and ignition to make it look a little bit more like this in the low end. Fudge a bit more to make it a little bit like this in the high end. With engine controls, we've widened our peak performance from about a 50 RPM range to a 400 RPM window. That's pretty good. The spark in the cylinder is kind of like a wave, and it's got more force as it gets going. We want to make sure we're giving the most force to the crank when we've got the best mechanical advantage. As the speed of the engine changes, the point where this optimization occurs changes as well. And that is why ignition timing can be so important. In the early days of electronic tuning, people had to figure out what meant what in the ECU coding. So they changed half the values in the ECU and see if it changed, say, fuel. If it didn't, they changed the other half of values and it would change fuel. Then they just keep changing half and half and half again and again until they found the value that affected fuel. Then they'd have to start all over again to maybe find ignition timing. Crazy! Nowadays, all that legwork's been done, and it's easier to know what to change in your ECU's coding to change what you want in the engine's performance. I mean, not for me. I don't know how the heck to do that. Other ECU tweaks to eke out performance without adding physical mods would be raising rev limits, fiddling with launch control settings, and removing undefeatable traction and stability control programs. But don't screw around with these things unless you really know what you're doing. The people who do know what they're doing are really good at it. I'm talking like beautiful mind stuff.
Extraordinary.
You shouldn't tune your engine unless you're a professional engine tuner. If you want to try around with a car you're not going to drive, do it as a hobby. There's guys who've been doing it since the early days of ECU, and they're still learning stuff. Whew, that's a lot to talk about. You want to take a break, click on that subscribe button. So how do we know that all the variables we're changing affect what's happening under the hood? We go back to the OBD. This is a fixed OBD2 reader, but the guys at Fixed are constantly pushing to see how intuitive they can make these interfaces. This transmits live data from your car's ECU to your phone or tablet. So when the car's running, it can display and record a ton of data. After you apply a new tune with Fixed live data, you can closely monitor oxygen sensor 1 voltage, oxygen sensor 2 voltage, oxygen sensor 3 voltage, oxygen sensor 4 voltage. All of these things are trackable and recordable and mappable with Fixed. That helps you make sure your new tune is safe for your vehicle. And if you think there's any improvements that could be made to the app, you can let the developers know. They're constantly looking for ways to make it better for people who use it. An OBD2 reader can also cue you into things that are hurting your performance outside of the tune. If one of your sensors is malfunctioning or clogged, it's going to screw up your performance because the ECU doesn't have an authentic picture of what's going on. You don't use these OBD sensors to tune the car. You need a separate computer for that. and big brains. But an OBD2 sensor with a good interface will let you know what's going on inside of it from the tune. But what about those chips that claim they can eke you out an extra 25 or 50 more horsepower without doing anything else? Look, most car companies are factory tuning their cars for optimum performance about a wide power band. They want you to have a well-performing car. Unless you're adding some hardware like a blower or maybe NOS injection, there is no way you're cranking out an extra 50 horsepower from ECU alone. If you have hardware like intakes and exhausts or headers, injectors, well, the engine's gotta be recalibrated, and that is where tuning comes in. So a chip with no hardware? It's bad news. Hardware with no tune? You're in trouble, buddy. Good tuning companies use in-cylinder pressure sensors or NOx sensors to keep from blowing things up. Good tunes are warranted and tested for thousands of miles in tracks and in garages. Tuning! Click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode of Science Garage.